Okay, so welcome to Chapter 5. This chapter is on groups and networks, and it's a very important chapter because learning about groups tells us a lot about society. For one, society needs groups. Groups form the building blocks of society and for most of social interaction. As human beings, we're not solitary creatures. We rely on groups from the very beginning for survival and for emotional fulfillment. And then throughout the rest of our lives, we work, learn, govern, pray, celebrate, mourn, entertain, all in groups. So we utilize others. We rely on others. George Simmel was the most influential sociologist in researching groups, and he researched the number of groups and how important it was how many members were in a particular group. George Simmel argued that the key element to determine the form of social relations in a group was the size of the group. He believed that as groups grow, they become more stable at the cost of intimacy. So, for example, a dyad, a group of two, is the most intimate group that can exist. And that is because if one person leaves in that group, the dyad is completely dissolved. So um, each person relies on that other person in order for that group to exist. There's also a certain level of symmetry happening between a group of two, and there's a certain level of dependency. So even if you have a relationship where you have one person who is the controlling, dominant person, and then the other person who is the subservient person who has to answer to the other person, there's still a dependency happening, and there's still a reliance on that other person. Because Simmel articulated that in order for a dyad to be a true dyad, both members had to consent to being in that group. So it couldn't be a forced type of situation. A triad is different. A triad is a group of three, and once a third person is added to the equation, the entire picture changes. For one, in a triad, you don't have that urgency for each member to stay in order for the group to exist. So if one person leaves, it doesn't mean that the group is going to be in jeopardy. Number two, the politics are different. You now have multiple points of views, multiple preferences, and when conflict happens, members of the group can take different roles, and the group can take many different directions. So, for example, the third person in a dyad can act as a mediator, the Tertius Gaudens, or divide et impera. The mediator would be the conflict resolver. So if there's conflict within a group, one person could be potentially the conflict resolver to try to get the others to get along and resolve the conflict. Tertius Gaudens would be a person who profits from the disagreement of the other two members. So, for whatever reason, if a person wants to divide the other members of the group, this is possible. Whereas this would not be possible with a group of two. And then divided impera, one member can purposely break up the other two and end the triad. So the point of this and what Simmel was so fascinated by was how we as people can behave and what are the capabilities of people and how the politics of a group can change once you have more than two people in a group. It's a simple concept, but a profound one because again, it shows just how much a group can affect an individual's behaviors, beliefs, or in values. Now, that being said, Simmel noted that as group sizes increase, the number of possible relationships increase. So you can see that in a group of 6, you have 15 possible relationships. And as these relationships increase, um, there's more likelihood that the group might be troubled by conflict or jealousy. The politics change. Now, I can go into detail and describe how these changes occur, what kind of changes I'm talking about. Now remember, Simmel liked to talk about groups in terms of their size. So that's how he approached groups, and he believed that the size of the group was very, very important. So he talked about small groups being very intimate, filled with face-to-face interaction, not formal in nature, so lacking formal roles, members having equality, so there are no power hierarchies, no one has more power than the other, and small groups are unifocal, meaning that there's only one center of attention at any given time. Now, parties are similar to small groups, except the only difference is that they're multifocal, so you can have more than one person being the center of attention at the same time. Now, Zimmel described large groups as much different. Large groups tended to be more formal, and they had status differentiation, meaning that they had hierarchies. So, as a consequence of people getting together in large groups, it became natural for one person to gain a position of power. And as he noted, this is apparent among many different groups in many different institutions in society. So, universities, middle schools, high schools, the workplace, places of worship. Again, all these organizations, these groups, tend to be able to function only with some kind of hierarchical structure. And this was really what Zimmel was trying to get at. Now, similar to George Zimmel, Charles Horton Cooley also had his own idea of the different types of groups in society and how these groups differ. So he talked about, instead of quantity, so looking at small groups, parties, and large groups, he talked about primary groups versus secondary groups. Primary groups being really most notably your family, being the group where most socialization occurs, being the group where members are irreplaceable. So you can't have a sister and then lose that sister. That sister will always be your sister no matter what. So its members are irreplaceable but are also enduring. But perhaps the most important thing to note about primary groups is that the group is an end to itself. So there's no reason for all of those group members, family members, to be together other than the fact that they just so happen to be family. Versus secondary groups, like the workplace, like schools, so people that are in your class, like people at different organizations that you might be a part of, people in church or whatever. Sometimes these people can transition, and if you spend a lot of time with someone and become really close to them, they can transition into a member of your primary group. But for the most part, we're talking about, think about it this way, acquaintances versus very close friends or family members. So these secondary groups, they tend to be less personal. And also, the key is that the group is not an end to itself. There is some purpose for that group. So you're associating yourself with these other people for some purpose. So if you're at the workplace, the only reason why you are even seeing that other person, developing a relationship with that other person, is because you guys have a common purpose of working, making money, and having that particular job. Same thing at a place of worship. You're all there for a reason, and with schools as well. Okay, so that's the main difference between primary groups and secondary groups. Cooley also talked about in-groups, meaning more powerful groups, oftentimes the majority, versus out-groups, less powerful, stigmatized groups, oftentimes called the minority. An example of this would be during the days of Jim Crow in the South. African Americans were part of the out-group, whites were part of the in-group. The main difference was that it was a matter of who had the power, who had more power and who had less power and was stigmatized for some role or status. Now, reference groups are also a very important concept to consider. Your reference group is a group to which we can compare our own position in society, a group that helps us define our own situation or status. For example, it's one thing to be poor and have everyone else around you be poor. It's another thing to be poor and to know that there are lots of other people out there living in the same country as you, or maybe in another country, that are living luxurious, carefree lives with indispensable amounts of money. In the second scenario, your own position becomes even more meager because you know that there is a much better quote unquote life being lived by other people. You know that there is a much more comfortable life being lived by other people. So when you compare your own life to these groups, your situation becomes even more meager looking. And I say that this concept is profound because we can actually see this concept being played out in authoritarian countries like, for example, North Korea, where the government purposely blocks access to the internet or international TV, movies, books, newspapers, etc., in an effort to keep the population from knowing what's out there. Because the idea is that we don't want our citizens knowing the kinds of lifestyles and freedoms that exist in other countries outside of our own borders. We don't want them getting any ideas, but we also don't want them to know there's any type of better or more free life out there. So that's reference groups. Now, moving on to group conformity, another very, very interesting aspect of this chapter. Um, One of the caveats of sociology is that when we're talking about groups specifically, is that people tend to want to conform to the group in which they are part of. For the most part, people tend to conform rather than to stand up, break away from the norms or values of the larger society and risk being ostracized. Um, a very famous experiment was conducted in the 1940s called the Asch test, where a group of people were brought together and were asked as a group which line on the right photo matched with the line on the left photo. Except there was only really one person who was being observed, and the rest were just actors, and they were shouting out the wrong answer on purpose. Now, what they found was most people did go with their own answer despite what the other actors said. But they found that a lot of people actually said the wrong answer. So if the group of people that they were with said line A is closest to the size of the picture in the left, a number of people actually said that they agreed that line A indeed was the same size as the picture on the left. So again, it's this idea that people tend to want to follow the norms or actions of the group in which they are involved with. And I cannot stress the importance of this concept because when you think about all the wars that have been committed throughout the history of human civilization, when you think about groups like the Nazis, and you question, you ponder, how was it possible that these people actually did this, that these people actually performed these heinous, inhumane acts? This idea of group conformity offers some answers. Again, it doesn't offer any excuses, but it offers some kind of insight into why people do the things they do. And one of the things that we learn is that when people get together in groups, especially groups with some kind of, like Zimmel noted, some kind of hierarchical um, group that carries some kind of position of power or dominance, some type of authority, people tend to do things that they might not do if they were alone. If you have a chance, please click on the link at the bottom right of this slide. It's called Stanley Milgram's Shock Experiment. Very, very, very powerful. It shows an experiment that was performed in, I believe, the 50s, where you had an actor behind a screen who was pretending to answer questions, right or wrong, to some questions that were being asked by a person who was standing in another room and that had access to shocks. And every time that that person had said the answer wrong, the man who was administering the shocks was told by another man sitting right next to him to go ahead and administer these shocks. And he kept administering the shocks no matter what, even though the actor in the other room was screaming, telling him, please stop. The man who was administering the shocks was being told by this other person in the room to continue, and so he did. And again, it's this idea that even though people might not, deep down inside, agree with what they're doing, when they have that authority figure or that group where everybody else is doing the same thing, everybody else is following the same norms, um, they tend to kind of disregard their own values and they tend to conform.